Ford had the flathead V8, Oldsmobile had the overhead valve rocket V8. Chrysler decided to go for a more outside-the-box approach when developing and then building their V8 design with a hemispherical V8, or hemi for short. Chrysler would develop their very first hemi during the Second World War for the Republic P-48 Thunderbolt fighter. The XIV 2220, which was an inverted V16 rated at 2,500 horsepower. The engine worked, but it was already 1945 by this point, and the war was more or less over. But Chrysler did work with Continental Motors to make a V12 Hemi head, which was used in the Patton tanks. Before diving in deep with this one, what is a Hemi? A Hemi is short for hemispherical combustion chamber. It's an efficient shape with an excellent surface to volume ratio with minimal heat loss to the cylinder head and room for 2 large valves. But this design only allows for 2 valves per cylinder. Intake and exhaust valves are on opposite sides of the chamber and require a cross-flow head design. Pistons are domed and protrude into the head at top dead center. It's possible to use flat top pistons in this design, but the stroke would have to be longer to get a good compression ratio. Spark plugs are inserted at or very near to the center of the combustion chamber to provide a strong flame. The Hemi head always has intake and exhaust valve stems that point in different directions. Chrysler offered the Hemi in 3 distinctive generations. Today we are only going to talk about the first generation, but it's important to point out the other generations. The second generation was the Elephant engine, the 426, which was produced from 1964 to 1971, and the third generation was produced from 2003 to present day. First generation Chrysler Hemi was produced from 1951 to 1958. It's important to note Chrysler and Imperial shared the Firepower Hemi. DeSoto had their own Hemi called the Fire Dome, and Dodge had their very own Hemi called the Red Ram. Plymouth didn't get a Hemi this go around, but they were supposed to get a Hemi V6 with dual overhead cam. Plans were scrapped when they saw the build costs. It's also very important to note that nothing is shared between makes with their Hemis. In other words, parts for a Chrysler 331 will not work on a Dodge 241 and vice versa. So let's start with all the Chrysler/Imperial Hemi engines, and then we're going to move to DeSoto and Dodge. I just feel like it would be easier to cover all the engines this way. Also, it's also important to note that Chrysler Firepower engines, that's what they were called in the very beginning when they were introduced in 1951. They didn't use the Hemi name, they used the Firepower name. They are over square, meaning the bore is larger than the stroke. Introduced in 1951, 331 cubic inch displacement Firepower/Hemi V8 5.4 liters. It made anywhere between 180 horsepower to 250 horsepower at 4,600 RPM. In the Chrysler 300 in 1955, this engine made 300 horsepower. Bore of 3.8 inches, a stroke of 3.6 inches, compression 8.5 to 1, featured 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used, it was used from 1951 to 1955. This engine was heavy, weighing almost 1,000 pounds, forged steel crankshaft. The intake valves were large at 1.81 inches on the intake and 1.5 inch exhaust valve. Cast in block bell housing flange. Making its debut in 1956, 354 cubic inch displacement Hemi V8 5.8 liters. It's good for 280 to 355 horsepower. The 355 horsepower figure could be found in the 300B. At 4,600 RPM, 380 pound-feet of torque at 2,300 RPM, with a bore of 3.9 inches and a stroke of 3.6 inches, compression 9 to 1. This engine was also found in the Dodge heavy-duty Power Giant from 1957 to 1959. Introduced in 1957, 392 cubic inch displacement Hemi V8. This was the biggest and baddest Chrysler Hemi V8 they made in the first generation. It was good from anywhere between 325 to 375 horsepower with a little bit of a caveat. The caveat being it could produce up to 390 horsepower when equipped with the Bendix electrojector. This was a Bendix system. It was also used on the Rambler Rebel 1 year prior, back in '57. Only 16 cars were produced with this fuel injection system, 15 of which were retrofitted with the carburetors after the fact because they were very, very problematic. This engine would produce an unbelievable 430 pound-feet of torque at 2400 RPM with a bore of 4 inches and a stroke of 3.9 inches, compression 925 to 1, 5 main bearings. This engine was used from 1957 to 1958. It could be found in the New Yorker, in the 300 series, or just about any Chrysler product it could be optioned into. Moving on to the DeSoto Hemi engine family. Introduced in 1952, 276 cubic inch displacement Hemi V8 4.5 liters. It was good for anywhere between 160 to 170 horsepower, 4,400 RPM, 250 pound-feet of torque at 2,000 RPM with a bore of 3.6 inches, a stroke of 3.3 inches, compression 7.5 to 1, 5 main bearings. This engine was produced from 1952 to 1954. It was found in DeSoto cars and wagons. In 1955, the engine was bored, which increased displacement to 291 cubic inch displacement Hemi V8 4.8 liters. It produced anywhere between 185 horsepower to 230 horsepower, 4,400 RPM, 305 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 RPM. Compression 7.5 to 1, 5 main bearings. Years this engine was used, 1955. And maybe used in 1956, sources vary. In 1956, DeSoto stroked to 241 to 330 cubic inch displacement, 5.4 liters. It was good for 230 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, 305 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 RPM. Compression 8.5 to 1, featured 5 main bearings. Also making its debut in 1956, the 341 cubic inch displacement V8. 5.5 liters. It made 320 horsepower, 5,200 RPM, 356 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM, with a bore of 3.8 inches and a stroke of 3.8 inches. Compression was 925 to 1. This engine was used between the years of 1956 and 1957, found in the Adventurer in 1956. Making its debut in 1957, this was the biggest and baddest DeSoto Hemi ever made. 345 cubic inch displacement, 5.6 liter V8, 345 horsepower at 5,200 RPM, 390 pound-feet of torque at 3,800 RPM, with a bore of 4.1 inches and a stroke of 3.4 inches, compression 1025 to 1. Moving on to the Dodge Hemis. Dodge introduced their very own Hemi in 1953. Do you see how that worked? It was like staggered like tier. 51 for Chrysler, 52 for DeSoto, 53 for Dodge. And it's very important to note, Dodge never had a V8 up until this point. Based on the Chrysler Firepower Hemi design, only downsized, Dodge offered the smallest of the Hemi engines. 241 cubic inch displacement Hemi V8 4 liters. It was good for 140 horsepower to 150 horsepower, 4,400 RPM. 220 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 RPM with a bore of 3.3 inches and a stroke of 3.3 inches. Compression was 7.5 to 1. 5 main bearings. This engine was used between the years of 1953 and 1954. In 1955, they would increase displacement to 270 cubic inch displacement, 4.4 liters. It would bump horsepower up to 183 to 193 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, 240 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 RPM. Bore of 3.6 inches, stroke of 3.3 inches, compression 7.6 to 1. This engine was used from 1955 to 1956. Introduced in 1956, and there's tons of conflicting information on this one. 315 cubic inch displacement V8 5.2 liter Hemi. Don't get this confused because Dodge also made a 315 cubic inch displacement polyhead. One day we will cover the polyhead in its own engine episode because it could get super confusing in this episode. This engine was only found in the D500 Dodge race car as a race, quote-unquote, race package. It could produce anywhere between 260 to 285 horsepower at 4,400 RPM, 330 pound-feet of torque at 2,200 RPM, bore of 3.6 inches, stroke of 3.8 inches. Moving on to the biggest and baddest Hemi that Dodge made in the first generation, 325 cubic inch displacement V8, 5.3 liters. It also went by the name of Super Red Ram. It's important to note that Dodge offered the 325 with poly heads, known as KDS, and a 325 Hemi KD500. This was good for anywhere between 285 horsepower to 310 horsepower. At 5,200 RPM, 350 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM with a bore of 3.7 inches and a stroke of 3.8 inches. Compression was 10-1. It was only used in 1957. So what ultimately killed the Hemi, or why did Chrysler stop making it? Some will say that emissions and fuel economy standards is what did this engine in, but in reality, it was too expensive to produce. Chrysler, you have to remember, was an engineering company, and they were trying other things behind the scenes. They developed their own overhead valve engine as well as polyheads as a cheaper alternative to the Hemi head engine, as well as doing some funky things with cross ram intake and long tube intake. And in 1960, the Slant 6 will come out, which was a revolutionary engine for the time. Their new overhead valve engines were making about the same power, and it was cheaper to produce. The Hemi would disappear after 1958. Fear not, it would come back with a vengeance in 1964 with the Elephant Engine 426 Hemi. Who else misses Chrysler? This was when Chrysler was at the top of their game in the late 50s, early 60s. God, I miss Chrysler. Anyway, now it's time for Would You Rather. This is a little bit different today. Out of all of these engines listed, which one would you rather have? Also, did you have the opportunity of owning any of these engines, and what was your experience having owned these engines in cars? Were there any in this group that were complete turds? Were there any in this group that were absolutely amazing? I got to drive my friend's 52 Saratoga and with a fluid drive transmission, and it was a 1952. It had a 331 Hemi, and it was a really cool driving experience. Like, it was different because I had the fluid drive, and it's been years since I drove it, but man, that car had so much pull. You could put it in third gear and drive it like an automatic transmission if you wanted to. That car had so much torque. Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section below will have their comment pinned to the top of it. Thank you all so much for coming out and watching this. If you'd like to get in touch with me, shoot me a comment in the comment section below, or check out our Facebook group. I call it the After Party. There's lots of car community. People share their rides, their stories, their experiences on there. And I really wish that YouTube would get to a point where you guys could share your pictures on here and we could message on here directly. I think that would be really cool. YouTube, if you're listening, that would be cool. Anyway, if you'd like to reach out to me and you don't have Facebook, you can send me an email. All of that information will be linked in the description below. Just know I appreciate all the support. And until next time, toodaloo!